One of the problems with ASP.NET AJAX, and in fact, most all AJAX implementations, is that the browser's back and forward buttons don't store the history of page state for an AJAX request. A browser recognizes only URLs, and because the page address doesn't change when something causes an AJAX request, the browser saves nothing in its history cache. It updates the history only when the user navigates to another page. So let's take a look at a page that uses AJAX in order to explore the problem. Here's a sample page. I'm just going to go ahead and view it in the browser. And as you can see, it displays a drop-down list of Northwind product categories, and then displays the products for the selected category in a list view grid. This list view control is within an AJAX update panel, so you don't get a full page post back anytime the user selects a different product category. Alright, so I just started the browser. Notice that my back and forward buttons are disabled, and I'll go ahead and select a few different categories here. Here are the convections, grains and cereals, produce, and finally seafood. So I've looked at what to the user probably appears like several different pages, or at least certainly different versions of the page. But notice that the back and forward buttons are still disabled. That's because we have only been looking at a single page and updating the contents of it using AJAX. Now I'm going to return to the default page for the application. And then I'll once again go to the products page without history. And I'll select a few different items here. And notice that the back button is enabled, except that the back button is going to take me back to the default page. So I can look at the history there, and the home page is the name of the default.aspx page. I'm still not getting any kind of AJAX history. So that's the problem. A user may navigate around this page looking at different categories and hit the back button because they want to go back to, say, confections, if that was the last thing they looked at, but they click the back button, and lo and behold, they end up on an entirely different page. And that can just be a very jarring experience. But we can do better. The AJAX history feature gets around these problems and makes the browsing experience much better for the user. It isn't enabled by default, and you have to do a little work to implement it, because you have to decide what kind of page state information to save. The hardest part is deciding how to implement this feature in a way that makes sense for the user, given the set of controls on the page that use AJAX. It's fairly easy to decide how to use the history for the sample application, because the display of the page is directly tied to the category ID that the user selects from the drop-down list box. Each time the user selects a new product category, that page state should become a history point. A history point is a saved state that you can navigate back to. Implementing history requires changes to the page and some code. So let's see how we can change that products page in order to implement AJAX history. The first change is to the script manager control on the page. That's located right here. You have to explicitly enable history by setting the enable history attribute to true. You also have to specify a method for the onNavigate event. This is the event that fires when the user navigates between pages. And I'll talk about the enable secure history state a little bit later. Alright, so we have a different script manager control. The other change that we need to make to the page is to place the drop-down list control and its data source into the update panel. So here those are. Back in the products page, those controls were located outside of the update panel because they don't have to be updated as part of the AJAX request. But in this new version of the page, with history enabled, the code has to be able to change the state of the drop-down list in order to return the page to a previous state. So those controls have to be in the Update panel. That's it for changes to the ASPX page. Let's take a look at the code behind file. Implementing the history feature requires two methods. The first method saves a history point in response to a new category selection by the user. So here's the selected index change event. The code starts by seeing whether the page is in the midst of an asynchronous postback, and it uses the script manager controls isInAsync postback property to check that. This is just an AJAX request. And it also makes sure that the user is not navigating to another page. If it's not an AJAX request and the user is navigating, then you don't want to save the state because the browser will take care of saving that state because the URL is going to change. So if it meets those conditions, then the code creates a unique title for the page by concatenating the string Northwind Products with the name of the category, and it gets that from the drop-down list. This is a good practice, both so that the page title bar displays a meaningful title, and because it'll become the title that displays within the browser history, which makes it easy for the user to go back and select a previous page state. Then the code creates a history point by using the script manager's addHistoryPoint method. The method has a few overloads, but the one that I used here passes a name for the query string parameter, the selected index within the drop-down list, and it's converted to a string, and then that title that was created. This method saves the state by generating a unique query string that the browser can add to its history. So here is where you need to make the decisions of what kind of state you need to be able to save and then return to. It's important that the state that you select is enough to return the page to the previous state, no matter what the user does in the meantime. So this can be the hardest part of using page history, just deciding what kind of state, because you can have multiple variables, all kinds of different things happening within the page. Then the second method that's required to implement history is to respond to the script manager's navigate event. This event fires when the user navigates to an item in the browser history list, and it passes in a history event args object. This contains the state that it reads from the query string parameter. The code starts out by reading that value. So this is the category state. That's how we use that name that we defined within this addHistoryPoint method call. If that value is null or empty, then it sets the selected index to 0. So it goes back to the first item in the list. If state is available, then it's going to convert that to an integer and then set the selected index of the drop-down list to that selection. And that's how it returns the page to that previous state. So let's see how this works. I'll go ahead and run the page. And there's the initial page load. And we don't have any history yet. The back button is still disabled. So I'm going to select seafood. And notice a couple things have happened. First, the back button is enabled. And we also got a different URL, and it has concatenated on there a query string parameter called category. That's what we defined within the addHistoryPoint method, and it includes that category ID. Then I'll go to dairy, and as you can see, we get the dairy products. At least I assume all those are dairy. But we went to the category number 3. Then we can go up and look at the browser history. And as you can see, we have the initial state of the page when it first loaded, and there was no category selected. That's the default category. and then we went to seafood, and then we went to dairy, and we can return to seafood, and now we get those products. We've restored the seafood state. And we can also use the back and forward buttons. So if I want to return again forward to dairy, I can click on the forward button, or I can go back to seafood, and I can go back to beverages. Now, there's one potential problem with this page. I went forward now to seafood. And again, you can see this category information, including the product ID. State information is visible to the user in the URL within the category query string value. This could be a security problem. So by default, ASP.NET actually encrypts the query string value. And you can control that with the Enable Secure History State attribute. So let's go back over to the code and change that. So I'm going to change that to true. I could also just remove the attribute because its default value is true. And I'll save the page and run it again. And I'll navigate to a different category. And now you can see that the URL has been mangled. And so now the user can't see the product ID. So that obfuscates the data. This is the default state when using AJAX history. And it's generally the one that you want to use. There's really generally no reason to display query string parameters to a user.